Alrighty. Okay, so first eRequesting meeting back after the Connectathon and just before our Easter break. And so we've got a bit of a packed agenda today, as we do these days for all of them, because this is only an hour-long call. So what we have on the schedule today, which has come out of our last meeting, is to go through our usual business and any of the updates on content, and also to do updates on actions from previous meetings. We want to go through and get an update on the eRequesting data for interoperability. Kylin will be doing that for us. Give a bit of a report back from Connectathon. And then we wanted to talk in this meeting about going through and looking at the that eRequesting data for interoperability and picking at least two elements to talk through and consider how does that come through, and starting to build out those principles for inclusion. That's kind of what we talked about in that last meeting. So we'll have Michael Wilson, who'll take us through some of that session. And then we wanted to go through, as we usually do, about next meetings. And I think it's time that we bring up our meeting cadence and how we want to go forwards with working through some of our topics. Bit of fair warning here. I had day off this week. It was a very short week anyway, so some of the slides might have some DVDs. We'll see how we go. All right, so approval, usual business. So approval of the minutes, that was from our last fortnightly 2 weeks ago. They were sent out for review. There's no outstanding feedback. So if you were part of that, hopefully you've had enough time to review. Please put your hand up if you want more time to review those minutes. And otherwise, I'll ask if someone's happy to motion to approve the minutes.
I just have to report that Angus and I haven't done that action assigned to us, but we will get onto it.
That's all right. We'll get to that in the actions part.
Thanks, David. I wasn't reading the screen there.
So is anyone happy to motion for approval of our last fortnight's minutes that have been sent around for review?
I'll motion to approve them.
Thanks, Michael. Is anyone happy to second approval?
I'll second it, Danielle.
Thanks, Angus. So what I'm going to do is trigger our poll, and I just happened to click the wrong button and stop sharing, but this is fine. It does not impact me popping out that poll for us to approve our previous minutes. So if everyone could go through and vote on those. If you didn't attend the meeting or haven't reviewed the minutes, you're quite welcome to abstain. We do want everyone on the line to vote who is able to do so. All right, that's 80% of us at least, just a couple of holdouts. All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to end that poll and share those results. And the motion has passed. We have approval of the previous minutes. I'll share my screen again and come back to the actions from our last couple of sets of meetings. I think, David, sorry that you said that you've not gotten to that one yet. All right, are we happy to defer that to the next meeting? Would that be about right? Which puts that on the 11th, I think, of April.
Yeah, I think it needs discussion and fleshing out. It's really just a thought bubble at the moment.
All right, we'll hold over that action item to get an update on that in the next meeting and see where you're at. We also had an action from to create a Confluence page to put in the content that was there on the slide around our additional features, and to allow people therefore to sort of comment and add on from Andy. And Andy's let me know that he's created that page now. I've popped that link there. If anyone's happy to also pop that in the chat for folks, but I'll just navigate to that now. So that is here with what we've talked about, and I think that's now here for us to keep working on as a technical design group.
Can I maybe ask, what's the difference between this and the previous task that David and I have about, like, are they not, why is ours called out as something special and not just on Andy's list of additional features to allow for comment and additions?
Are you trying to make me do the work, Angus?
It's one angle, but I'm what's so special about task ownership to make it different to request group or all the other things on that list?
I don't know. The action that was documented, because the discussion was that David was of the position that practitioner role was important for task, and that you were of the position, Angus, that organisation was important, and that we should add to the scaffold as soon as we can a owner for the task. And since we couldn't resolve that conversation in the last meeting, it was held over for people to work on it. And the two people who are going to work on it are you, Angus, and David, and then come back to the group. If you don't think that's a task we should keep working on, then
I just
that doesn't continue.
I guess to me, there's lots of tasks for us to work on, and Andy's got a big list of them. Here. And this is just,
hello.
Well, have you just another one on? Sorry, Jackie. Yeah.
Oh.
No.
Oh no.
I think that maybe
I think she wasn't on mute.
Excellent. So the proposal was for an action in the meeting to take that forwards, and you both accepted, which is why it's here as an action.
Yeah,
if you didn't, it wouldn't be. If you don't think that actually, that's a good governance point. So if we've raised an action out of a meeting and coming back, we want to look back and go, you know what, actually, I don't think that's the right way to carry that forwards. This is a good point to have that discussion and go, actually, here's how I think either it's no longer relevant or what else we should do.
Yeah, that's kind of my point. If you look at Andy's list, like it's a whole list of work that is like a list we have to do, right? And at some stage, I'd like to think we're going to prioritize what we really have to do first. What are we going to focus on? And I'm not saying this task owner thing isn't, is that now at the top of the list, and that's why we're breaking it off into its own group and working on it? Or is it just somehow come in from sideways that it's, so to me, Andy's created a list of stuff we have to do, right? And to me, the task owner thing is also something we have to do. But I think it feels a little bit through accident that somehow task owner is the most important thing to do, and therefore has been broken off to a single task for us to do. I kind of think we're triaging Andy's list to going, which is the most important thing or top 3 things we're going to do, and let's then break them into discussions and work about doing them. Is task owner at the top of that list?
I think the difference here is that when we were going into the scaffold originally, that was a pretty minimal approach of effectively a task and a service request. And even to get to that scaffold stage without any of those additional features being looked at, we had a fundamental question even with that very basic scaffold. And that's why I think the task owner was kind of highlighted at that point, because it was so fundamental.
I called out task owner because we were creating a scaffold that we were about to take to the Connectathon the next 2 days afterwards, which we've now had. And at that Connectathon, there was a role of filler who were to consume tasks. And if a task did not have an owner, then those fillers effectively had nothing to do. That was my point about the scaffold did not have task owner. And I was raising the point that that's going to be very difficult in the Connectathon if no tasks are owned by anyone. That was my only point. And
yeah, I don't think that was the issue though, because David raised an issue around is the task owner an organization or is it a practitioner role?
Agreed. So I was asking, at a minimum, for the scaffolding, for the bare minimum we have, could we add the owner so that people could do work in the Connectathon? And then we had the discussion about, should it be owner, should it be more? And I'm great, but I was looking for like a bare minimum for the Connectathon for the scaffold. Like I would have thought, I still struggle with why was task owner not included in the scaffold. It's kind of to the basic to me. That's not to say it shouldn't be extended, and that's really what this question's about. But to me, we've talked about request group, right? Like, is that not just as much of a relevant thing for us to be talking about high up the list?
Do we want to take the technical part of this offline? I think what you were saying was, why is it separate? Why is this task separated from all the other tasks? I'm happy to just take this offline and keep it as a high level thing that we report back onto the group.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
Yes.
fine.
Yeah, and if you feel that it's no longer relevant, then you can raise that as dealing with it in this way. That's totally reasonable. I think it's got separated out just because it was a specific point, and we said, let's have an action, and everyone said, yes, let's have an action. I think that's literally the only reason why. All right, so come back to us, and if the path forwards is to fold that back into work or to do something else, come back to us with that. And our last action from previous meetings was on Chris about facilitating clarification of the G3 use case, which was cancel. And we talked about that being distinct from failure to fulfill. Chris, can you speak to that briefly on where that's at?
Yeah, so that's been updated both in the proposed use cases page and in the R1 use cases page, which we are keeping in sync moving forward. I've added an inline comment against it just to double check whether the wording is generally acceptable for the group. So, so this is in addition to all the rest of the feedback we've had on these pages. Please keep reviewing and adding details to them so we can put together the final ones for the IG. But you'll see, yeah, so it's on this page, keep going, it's the last bunch, yep. So as this cancellation has occurred before the provider has started the service, e.g. for G03, before the patient has attended the provider, hence is not considered a non-fulfillment of the service. The other aspect of that is whether we need to have another use case for non-fulfillment. Is that something that feeds into the request part, or is that just part of the downstream workflow? So looking for feedback on all of this. So yeah, you've got the on both of these pages, you've got details there for providing feedback. So looking forward to feedback from the group.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So popping back to our actions and updates. So we've gone through approval of minutes and actions, and I also wanted to introduce people to Michael Wilson, who's joining us as a FHIR solution architect. And I'll get Michael, hopefully you're on the line, to do a little bit of an introduction yourself. But what that really means for the technical design group and Sparked is that Michael is coming on board for us full time to spend his time looking at facilitating our architecture discussions and supporting those through the community, going away and doing research and doing some of that preparation and work through some of the proposals. And also, I think, really forming some of the, working really, really closely with the technical community and how we can bring in some of those experiences into the technical design group, and also then through development and piloting in any of our testing spaces. So Michael, did you want to sort of pop on camera and say hi?
Yeah, I'm on camera. Been here. Yeah, I joined Spark now, so I think this is my second or third week now. Lost count already. I've spent the last couple of years working at the Digital Health Agency, worked on aged care transfer summary, worked on some modernisation projects there around the use of FHIR for My Health Record, as well as touched on the FHIR project and some other modernised ones there. Prior to that, I spent a number of years working on the consumer data right, the introduction of the consumer data right in Australia and open banking. So I was involved in the initiation of that in Australia. So I've got a real bent for things like authentication, workflow. So hopefully there's a lot I can bring and work through with you here in eRequesting for that.
Thanks, Michael.
I'd just like to give Michael an endorsement. I've worked with Michael before. Don't listen to a word he says. He doesn't know what he's doing. Michael is great to work with, and he's already starting to push the agency to develop a more detailed position on some of the architecture for the HIE. Having worked with Michael before, I'm really confident that we're going to see a real acceleration in our vision for the underlying infrastructure that we see supporting this use case. So welcome, Michael. It's great to have you.
Thanks for that, David, and I'll pay you later. All right. But yeah, also I think I'm more than happy to have robust, challenging conversations as well. So I'd like to challenge you, and you can challenge me on different opinions. So
Thanks, Michael and David. So at this point, I want to hand over to Kylin to take us through some of the update on where we're at the eRequesting data for interoperability, because there was a CDG meeting pretty recently that has, I think, progressed where they were from when we were looking at it a couple of weeks ago.
Thanks, Danielle. Yes, so we had a meeting to go, I guess, kick off the eRequesting data for interoperability post the, I guess, in-person workshop. And that was held on the 19th of March. Can you move to the next slide, or can I? Yeah. So we presented this diagram, which I think most of you have seen before or seen some version of it, just this idea of kind of what we saw as potentials to sit within eRequesting DI, and what kind of sat on the technical side and what might get pushed forward to or be done within the eRequesting DI, but actually also truly sat within the AUCDI R2, and what kind of has already been done. So we kind of just walk through this at an overview, high level. And then next slide. And kind of presented that this idea that while there was all these things on that kind of mind map, we were kind of focusing, and then I think if you click next slide and twice, oh, sorry, that's it. We would really be focusing on the top level. So looking at those service requests at the generic level, and then the things that were specific to lab or path, and then that the specific things that would sit for imaging and examination, and then some additional items that were noted of interest from the last workshops, which was the pregnancy and gestational menstruation type things, and also this need for medical device summary. So we also, I guess, to get to here, we looked at what we talked about at the workshop in person the month before, as well as having a look at a bunch of request forms that we could find online. So we looked at a number of forms for pathology requests as well as imaging requests, and then kind of looked and kind of did a cross reference to kind of see what was common. And then I think you have the next slide, please. So when we looked at it, like, we could see that they were quite different. There wasn't as much consistency as we were hoping, and we could see kind of how complicated or how different each of them were in slightly different ways. And we kind of just raised this with the clinical design group to say, hey, like, there's a bunch of different things. We were focusing around the pregnancy, LNMP, EDC, menopausal, menstruation type areas, and there's a difference in terms of how they're presented in the forms, whether they're checkboxes, yes, no answers, there could be dates, things like gestational age. They're asked in slightly different ways, but all kind of asking for the same type of information. So, how many weeks they are pregnant, or the gestational age, or the EDC. So, and I think there was also EDD in some of them. So we were kind of walking through the CDG, sort of the different types of data that the forms are all seems to be collecting in slightly different ways, and asking them whether we should include this in the Australian eRequestDI, or whether we should not. We asked them whether we needed to support sort of this sort of questionnaire type format of whether we needed support like that, yes, no, or whether we wanted to do some fully modeled type things where we looked at pregnancy status rather than pregnancy yes, no. So if you go to the next slide, yes, so just sorry, click through those. So those were some of the issues that we wanted to raise with them, just to get them to think about it. But then after doing that, we asked them, should these things be in scope for eRequesDI R1? And we asked them for both pathology individually as well as radiology. So the results were really to actually not include any pregnancy information for eReqDI. So for a request, we won't be wanting to include any pregnancy information for pathology or radiology, but rather push it to AUCDI R2 and do a proper pregnancy status modeling. That was the same for pregnancy duration. So things covering gestational age, gestation, EDC, EDD. LMP, last menstrual period, was also asked, and we had sort of the same response, that they would prefer to exclude it from eReq, but to push it to AUCDI R2. Next slide, please. We were also looking, because one of the checkboxes on the form was post-menopausal, I think it was. So we were asking about that sort of menopausal information, whether we should include it. It was the same question was asked for pathology and radiology, for perimenopausal information, and it was voted that we should push it to R2 as a menstrual status rather to do a data group. The only one that was cast to be kept in was medical device information for radiology, and they were preferring that we start to model it how we would in AUCDI rather than a questionnaire type response. So we're kind of working through that one next. And that kind of was where we sat with all of that. And then, so the next slide. So this will be what I'm going to present at our next meeting. So essentially that's kind of where we're sitting now, excluding the pregnancy, EDD, the last menstrual period and menstrual status, and just have the service request information and then the medical device information there as well. And for our next meeting, we'll be focusing on the service request, the generic, the pathology, and the imaging requests. Next slide, I think. So our upcoming sessions are sex and eRequesting. So we'll be spending an hour just focusing on the sex conversation and what that sex field really is. And then the 23rd of April will be our normal regular meeting, and it will be that service request and the eRequestDI focus. I think that's all I had, Danielle.
Okay, Caitlin, can I ask a question? So just in those slides you went through about sort of suggestions about what's in R1 and what's not. Sorry, you're saying, I missed the context of when you said we decided it's in R1 or it's not, or pushed out to R2. Who was the we in that conversation?
So we presented, or I think we went through each of the questions with the CDG and we did a vote. Right. I don't have any slides on it, Danielle. So, but no, we did, okay. And I'll be posting those results on. So we did a Mentimeter vote. Those were in the room.
In the CDG,
in the call.
In the CDG call.
In the CDG call on that 13th of March. And the results will go up on the notes, and we'll have the Mentimeter slides up as well, so you can have a look.
Okay.
So just, I think to confirm, because my understanding so far of the 17th of April one is we're actually looking to make that joint across the clinical design group and the technical design group. So this is sort of a proposed meeting on, what day is the 17th of April actually?
Is it a Thursday?
It's a Wednesday. So there's a proposal that the clinical design group and the technical design group get together on the 17th of April and have a joint meeting on sex and eRequesting.
We were going to trial, weren't we? Like what does it mean for eRequesting if this was must support as an exercise, as to what does it mean up and down the stack to make something must support? sort of two birds with one stone. Like, what does eRequesting think about sex in eRequesting, and what does it mean if like core makes it must support? What does that mean for eRequesting?
Yeah, I think we'd want to put together a joint agenda. I'm very muchly in support of having this conversation as a joint meeting. I think that's what we want to take through in terms of understanding what systems have, what's driving from the clinical direction, what are we committing to from an eRequesting perspective. So I'm fairly massively in favour of that for the 17th of April session. And I guess this is the first time that the technical design group themselves are hearing about that, because none of the invites or anything have been, sent out yet. So that's really the overall objective of that session, which is different to the fortnightly technical design groups. Can I just get, are there any concerns or objections with having a joint meeting with the clinical design group, from this group and the clinical design group, to go through and have that discussion? And if you have a concern or objection, you could pop your hand up and we'll go to you and you can say what your, Andy, yes.
I don't have any objections to that meeting. I do have more an objection to going into R1 with no clinical information whatsoever in an eRequest. I think I think that's from pathology. Having pathology requests, I just don't think it's going to work. I don't think it's. It will not be something that could be trialed with clinical safety. In line with existing requesting practices. I think not saying anything is going backwards. And it'd be very surprising if we could actually get that kind of to go through. So I am wondering whether the input from the clinical design group is more, we haven't come to a decision as yet about a recommendation for that. So in fact, or actually that then becomes an issue for the technical design group to say, well, we got to create a minimal viable product in this space. So that I think needs to be a broader kind of discussion for adoption.
Okay, I think Heather, you've put your hand up in relation to Andy's concern.
Yeah, it's I guess it's framing what was presented to the clinical group and responding to Andy's concerns. And I hear you, except what we presented to the clinical design group was the high priority items that came out of the face-to-face one. So basically where all the green dots were, it was all around that kind of thing. So we presented it to them and we gave them the alternative of should it be just a checkbox, pregnant, tick, or what are the problems with conveying clinical information just with a single true only checkbox available. And basically the feedback was very strong from the clinicians that was meaningless. So all of those things that were in that slide that was showing the pregnancy related things, menopausal status, last menstrual period, they all said this is irrelevant. And the radiology representatives there were saying we would be asking this anyway. So if you're giving us this tick box, it really doesn't help. We'd always be asking about pregnancy status and so on. So at the moment, all of those things that we have currently been putting on forms traditionally, and certainly in the paper world, we had pushback from the clinical group saying it is not useful. We don't fill it out and it's not actually helping the people receiving it. So there's not going to be no clinical information. It will be free text, which we discussed too. So we were carefully trying to frame the let's not go backwards and have less information. Let's not make it, that was a tension that we'd heard from you guys saying we've got to make sure that we keep what we're doing. But when we presented that information, we got, it was almost contempt from some of the clinicians saying this is so, want it. It's not useful and we don't want to record it, and we probably never record it anyway. So we gave them the opportunity, I guess, to reimagine what this clinical information needs to be. And I was surprised at the outcome, but I'm honestly quite pleased because I think that the checkboxes aren't helpful. And we now have an opportunity to go forward in a next iteration to actually start to say, what do you think really does need to be structured and meaningful, and how can we auto-populate it from what the clinicians think we need to put into eReqDI in the next release. And I actually think that's a better way forward in the longer term. But it was a very strong, I was surprised at the outcome, and I was surprised at how important, there were more people voting positively for having real kind of persistent information around health devices than I expected as well. So it was a truly a surprising outcome, but I think it's actually quite good. And I know it's a bit of a shock, and it's a surprise to you guys as well, because you were kind of braced to do this, but it scopes it down for the first release, and I think it triggers more constructive discussion with clinicians about what should be recorded in systems, and then how we extract that or auto-populate it for an exchange purpose, and making sure that it's actually carrying the information we need.
So we've got a lot of hands up, and I'm going to ask if someone who has the link to, and I assume the clinical design group was recorded, if they can pop that into the chat so people can view that discussion if they weren't part of that, and see how that went. But coming back to this, before I go to the top of the list, I just want to say, continuing this discussion, Andy, I think you had your hand up. Did you want to further comment on that, on Heather's response?
Yeah, I just think we've got to be careful though. I know we like to go to, it's a checkbox. The reality is that there are going to be various ways for clinical systems to elicit and to record the information into this, because basically, the IG is describing interoperability between organizations. So it's a mechanism of defining the data that can be carried. How that data is populated is not determined by the implementation guide. And I think there is a lot of voices to this that need to be taken into account. Certainly the placer as a clinician and how they wish to interact with their practice management systems or clinical information systems is certainly an issue. It's not something we are recreating or providing from an IG perspective constraints around. We are defining a contract, an information and workflow contract between organizations. So I think we got to be quite careful that where this is manifesting, there may be additional kind of guidance and documentation that the CDG wish to provide to the community, and that's certainly up to them. But from a implementation guide and a FHIR TDG perspective, we are defining an information model to support interoperability, and I think we kind of would be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater in some of this stuff. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
Thanks, Andy. Angus.
Specifically on this pregnancy status thing and the Boolean, I think we've got to be careful as to what to me, the pregnancy status yes/no thing is more like a flag today. And what I mean by that is at Sonic, we receive it and we display it to collection staff, this status, like pregnant, yes, no. But we don't, it is then recorded by the collection nurse independently, right? So just highlighting that there's this difference between what is truth statements in the placing system about pregnancy, and then the further detail about that pregnancy is somewhat different to something that's more like a flag that is telling the other organization, be cautious here because we suspect they're pregnant. It's like, it's not trying to be a true statement, it's trying to be a flag to the other side to say, you need to talk to the patient about pregnancy because there's an indication here they are. And I mean, that's how Sonic treats this. We don't pass the data through from A to our system unchecked. We present it to the collector. The collector then independently clicks a flag to say pregnant in our system. And you can argue whether that should be a Boolean in our system, but the point of the status is to have the conversation with the patient at collection, not we do not pass it one for one through. And so I'm just trying to highlight that nuanced difference as there's truth statements in a source system about their pregnancy, but then there's this notion of trying to start a conversation on the other side, warning them that be cautious of pregnancy stuff here is kind of how it's being used. Anyway, that's all I had to say.
Thanks, Angus. If there are no more questions or comments on that topic, noting we are sort of scheduled to get to let's start talking about the eRequesting clinical requirements coming in from that data for interoperability, and how will we approach them as a technical design group, and what is our acceptance or feedback coming from that, and what will that end up feeding into the FHIR IG is we've sort of popped that on the agenda today, and I think that further discussion on this topic is probably better held to that. And so I think what we want to do is move on from this update from the eRequesting data for interoperability. And I encourage everyone who's here to go to the clinical design group that will be happening in April, to also participate in that and have that understanding of what's going on in, I guess, real time instead of these later updates. So we had a couple of other things on the agenda. One of them, just moving past the slides, is a report back from the Connectathon. And I might actually ask us to time box that as much as we can, so that we can move on and continue talking about the data for interoperability, and also how we want to go forwards with our next meetings and meeting cadence, because our meeting invite series kind of runs out this month, although we're generally scheduled for fortnightly. So I really want to get to that at the end and how we want to go forwards. That being said, Michael, are you happy to do a run through of that report back from the Connectathon?
Yep. In light of that, I'll try and do a really quick run through with that. So we had a really good 2 days. First day was in a tent. The second day was a bit better, but day at the Connectathon. So we're really looking at engaging implementers who wanted to work with diagnostic requests in FHIR. We wanted to discuss the foundation around that scaffold that we had, and we kind of wanted to discuss the future steps towards the creation of the IG. So for that, we had a number of system roles. We were looking at testing in the Connectathon. We're looking at fillers, places, patient agent, and the repository service. So we had quite a few people at the Connectathon who wanted to be fillers and places, or both. We didn't have anyone really testing as a patient agent. That didn't really come up. So hopefully we can do that maybe in the future. Look at that one more. Do you want to jump to the next one? And we had a number of test scenarios that we were using to prompt the connectivity in the Connectathon. We had a number of scenarios there for places and fillers around creating unassigned requests for places, assigned requests, looking at the current workflow status. So a placer, after they've placed it, can go back and have a look at it and see where it's at. And we also, this was probably more a discussion point than actually doing, was around whether we're sort of updating resources like patients, or whether we're creating them for each request. And there was a number of discussions held around that, about what would be appropriate. On the filler side, we were looking at the search queries to pull out the tasks that are assigned to the provider. Looking at trying to pull them out based on group identifiers as well. Looking at updating using transactions, so we could update our bundle of tasks with one transaction, update the status of those tasks, and also talking through approaches to managing those eRequests and processing them. I'll jump to the next one. So on the day one, we had a showcase from Telstra Health, who did a successful creation of a service request as a placer. Also, Telstra Health and Sonic were showing us the approaches they used to query the task. So a number of those FHIR use cases where you can find tasks based on their group identifiers or with a certain status or when they're assigned to you and the like. On day two, we had quite a few demos for us. We had MediRecords who used webhooks to create a service request. The Beta EMR integrated into our system as a placer to create a service request. Sonic showed us the processing of a service request and converting it to V2 messages for internal processing. We also had this wasn't demoed, but a number of people I talked to were trying the tests on the resource contention, which is making sure that you only update the version of the task you're expecting. You don't overwrite someone else's changes. And all up, we had 87 tasks with 75 service requests and 9 completed. I mean, that's not true representation because they were being changed all the time, back and forth and around the place. But that was a good indication of how many we processed. The next one. Lots of discussions. I think this was probably the real value I saw in it, is that getting people to start playing with it. It means they start asking questions, having to understand how it works. We had discussions on cancellations of orders. When can you cancel them? Can you cancel them? How do you cancel them? Do you create a new one, or do some of the processes around that? We looked at using this is when I talked before about whether we create a new patient for each order or whether we're going to update an existing patient. We looked at put and patch for updating task status. We had a number of technical problems there. I managed to get that to work after the Connectathon, so it is possible, but that was a good one to look at. We looked at all the different types of status and their usage, whether they're technical status or their FHIR status or placer status. Oh, they're the ones just listed below there. And patient journeys, multiple bookings, how we might manage those. Some things around the update of orders, how if they were updated after the placer originally placed it, when can it be updated? Can it be updated? Similar to the cancellation. And the grouping of tasks came up, and sequencing of orders as well was another discussion point. Next. A couple of things came up that we found in the Connectathon. We found that the use of profiles wasn't really used when service requests and tasks were being created, which means that they weren't being validated. We had some challenges with test data. We had a set of test data we could use. Some people had a bit of a problem with it, and we probably need a more complete set of test data that can be used in the future. We found there was a problem with the order of resources in a transaction bundle, that the actual order was important, and they had to be in the correct order for it to work. And we had some problems getting the patch to work. And little bit of feedback was around some simpler examples that's kind of get started. And also we need more discussions around the guidance and use of group identifiers. I don't know if Andy or Angus has anything else they wanted to add on anything we got out of the Connectathon.
I think it's a pretty good summary.
I agree. I thought there was a very large conversation about sort of the put posts when you update stuff in the repository. I think there's a lot of learning still to happen there. About it's one thing putting a new service request task in there because it's a new object, but what do you do about all the objects that may not be new, like the patient already persisted, the practitioner already persisted, all those is still stuff to work through about when placing an order in something like an order repository. What do you do about them? There's a lot of discussion about that.
Yeah, it should be noted too that it's not just a patient issue. It's the same thing for organizations, practitioners, practitioner roles. There's really common kind of repeated reference points for the requests themselves. How you deal with them becomes quite a data governance issue, and in particular where there is the odd occasion where you want to temporarily modify one of the attributes for a particular purpose. Should that be then modifying that same referenced resource for all previous kind of references to that practitioner? So obviously that's an issue. Everyone's got to know the consequences of such a data creation update governance issue.
I also thought another aspect of it was whether it's sort of about our scope almost is whether you're putting the orders in an independent repository dedicated to this purpose, or whether you're just exposing your clinical data model for someone to get the orders out of, which also affects this idea of updating patient or not. You know, to me, if you think about it with the lens of it's a second repository sitting over there that I have to put the data in, then you kind of make a copy over there. But if you think about this as, no, I'm just a clinical system that has all the data and I'm exposing service requests, well, do you duplicate the patient in your clinical system for that service request? It was just another angle that I thought made it hard to think about. Like, what is the scope? Are we building eRequesting on top of an existing clinical model, or are we building requesting as an independent service that sits over outside of a working system?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thanks both. There's a question in the chat around where can they get access to some of the materials and updates from the Connectathon. Someone could pop in the link to the track page. That would be great. David, you've popped your hand up. I really do need to time box this because we're running quite a bit late. But if you have a comment or something, if you could put that in the chat, or if there's something you think is crucial now, you've put it down. Okay, thanks. So what we also had then on the agenda was actually moving to this, which seemed like something that we were actually really quite interested in. And I think that we'd had scheduled on there to pick a couple of items at least and actually start talking about it. And we're not going to have time today because at the moment all we have are hours every fortnight. And I think what we need to do is talk about our mechanism for doing this. How are we going to approach this? How do we want to take that through? And when and how are we going to have this discussion around what these eRequesting requirements are and further content? That's my perspective. Michael, you were originally sort of going to actually start that conversation in facilitating that for the group. Do you want to sort of propose to the group on a way that we can take this forwards?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we had quite a bit of a talk about this already in this meeting, but I think one of the things we need to identify is how the technical design group is going to manage this information that's coming from the eRequesting data for interoperability. So we've got this mind map here, which shows where the areas of focus are and things that the CDG has identified that things might be potentials for our IG. But we need to work out how we're going to manage what goes into the IG, what doesn't, what we take from that clinical group and what we defer. So I think a lot of the things that were discussed this morning fell into that bottom part there with supporting information about things being pulled out potentially. But we've got to go through the generic service request, the imaging request, pathology, some of the things we talked about there about the mapping to patient and the use of sex and gender and the like, with that falling into AU core. So we've got to work out how we go through this, how we prioritize, how we work out what's important for us to get into our release 1 of the IG and the like, and coming up with an approach for dealing this and going through them, prioritizing them, ticking them off as we go through them. So I'm open to ideas about how we do this, or whether we have dedicated sessions and the like to go through this, or it's just something we bring up in these meetings and work through it as we go. Is there any areas of specific interest where we start potentially?
Do you have a suggestion, Michael, or do you want to open that to the TDG?
I think it's open. I mean, potentially makes sense, I think, to start with the generic service request. That going through what's been identified in the CDG for that, whether it's easy to map, whether there's anything there we don't think is appropriate or we can't map at the moment or we need more. But definitely open to ideas about where we start and how we do it.
Okay, so that's open now to the technical design group. If you want to comment on that, please raise your hand. I think I have a comment, but as chair, I need to leave that to the end. Andy?
I think the goal of eRequesting is actually to be implementable at some point, and therefore I think we have to look at the appetite of the marketplace and what would make it more likely to adopt. There is a significant friction in doing new work if there is already something in play that is kind of working. So it needs to absolutely be a value add in that space. A lot of this map is not obviously clinical. And many of the features that we've talked about become quite operational in what they're looking to support. Certainly from the stakeholders we've talked to, they are quite vocal about the features that are a must-have in terms of making a shift and being able to use this as an alternative to either paper or the existing version 2 ordering that's in play. So I think we've got to be quite pragmatic about prioritization. There are things that are easier and kind of we can set and play because that first release of eRequesting is going to be for trial use and feedback. We want those early examples of use to say this is unusable or this is actually good enough, or we think that change needs to occur. It's in all of this, it's very difficult to create a kind of paper-based exercise to come up with what you purport to be what seems to be the best solution on paper, but only then to find in the real world it doesn't really work as well. So I think we do have to be quite pragmatic in its ability to be implemented, and we certainly have found that many of these things are actually quite straightforward to implement. There's not a lot of alternatives because if we want to support a feature like this, there's only a limited set of ways that FHIR supports this pattern within that scaffold that we have agreed to.
Is, Andy, something that some of those things you've talked about are principles for how we approach this that we can agree on and we could put down and agree on, and this approach is the principles for looking at this. So like you said, so it's implementable, so we can actually move forward.
Yeah, I think certainly it would be helpful to we could try for a kind of a trial set up front, but certainly the principles will harden up as we go through our discussions so that we can step back and go, some of these, there's some consistent patterns of our thinking around this, and those principles should help us then in our discussions. Obviously, principles are made to be broken in some ways, but it's the reasoning about why you created the principle in the first place, which is really I think the core value.
Yeah. Do you think there's some you could bring to the next meeting? Maybe some general principles.
Yeah, as long as I get some time after Easter.
So we've got about 4 minutes left to the end of this meeting, and what I am keen on, unless other people put their hand up, is getting practical. What are our next steps? I agree with Andy, and so far what I've heard from the technical design group in this meeting and the previous meeting is consistent with Andy's position about our need to carefully consider these items and that we are going for something that is implementable. What I think we need to do at this point is agree on how do we do that. It's one thing to say we're going to do it, but is that where we meet and we discuss it for 15 minutes every fortnight? That suggests to me that we're not actually going to achieve something, and I don't think that's where we can live. So I think we need to move into a much more practical space. There are tools available to us, including changing our meeting cadence so that we aren't just an hour a fortnight, that we also look at making use of asynchronous techniques of someone going, let's have a crack at this and put this on Confluence as a thing that people can indicate if they think that this is something that we need to prioritize for R1 or R2 and to add their further feedback on. But I do think we need to move away from just having our hour a fortnight in which we discuss much business.
I'd like to think, Danielle, aren't we close to start agreeing on what we don't disagree on, like moving through the profiles and as a group and seeing what elements can we look at where we all nod our head and go, yep, we'll agree, and somewhat lock that in, but fairly swiftly moving over others which are contentious. Not to say they don't need to be addressed, but let's do what we can do now and put aside what we have to come back to later.
I think you're absolutely right. I think we can do that. From all the discussions, it seems like we have some really consistent positions on those basics, but we do have to just go, yes, 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 we agree. So how do we do that? Okay, so our next scheduled meeting is the 11th, so it's in a fortnight. We could look at people who are happy to put their hand up to say, you know what, I think there's a whole number of things we agree on, be those like the service request and the task and how they relate to this data model, that we can just bring that to the next technical design group in a fortnight, along with ensuring we discuss how we will move forwards with the other parts of our work, especially the bits where we don't agree. I'm hearing, and I 100% agree, that we have parts where we agree and we need to confirm those, but we also have parts that we don't, or we're not sure of all those features where we need to work through them. And we have to discuss how do we do that. So I'm suggesting that. Why don't we do that? Do people want to put their hand up to say, I can have a crack at what should we do as the basics for like a generic service request and task, or we'll come to something and we can run through that in the technical design group. I do think we need to send that out before we meet on the 11th so people have the opportunity to look at it for those basics. So as I'm suggesting, let's prioritize the obvious things that we apparently all agree on and make sure that we actually do all agree on them.
The problem with doing the basics of the service request and isolation is that their need is contextualized by features of some of those more advanced features. So you kind of can't look at the basics in isolation in some ways. I think maybe I think it does help to talk about real kind of the reality of some of those features. Can I suggest that with that list that I put up in Confluence, that we just get people to I'll put an extra column in there and say, people just put a tick box or a plus or a minus or whatever in there, and just some indication of the importance people think of those things. I don't know, another way of, if you can do a more kind of fancy voting or whatever, I'm happy to do that. I just wanted something simple, and then it would give us kind of a rough ordering set, and we could just start with that and work our way from the beginning. If it doesn't work, after 2 or 3 we'll go, it didn't work, we need another way of doing it, but it would at least give us a way of starting some of these discussions.
We could convert this and then send it out to the eRequesting TDG pretty quickly on a way to like upvote things. We could do that with our tooling.
Excellent. Sounds like an action item for Danielle.
Yeah, I'll accept it. I proposed it, so yeah, I'll do it. And I'll also say, since no one else has put their hand up, that I disagree that we can't consider some things in isolation. There are some things that hold true, like a test name, like the service name. Can we not just agree on that for now? There's some really, really basic, the scaffold things around the fact there's a patient, there's all these things. Is it mandatory? Is request a practitioner role? Like, I really feel like there's some absolute back to fundamental basics that go across no matter what these things are that we could agree on.
Are you saying agree on it must support?
No.
So they're already in the service request anyway. It's not like we're restricting, you're not allowed to have one of these. But if you're then talking about, for instance, if someone raised around barcodes and tokens and stuff, like that's a deeper discussion about the structuring and use of barcodes and tokens. There is a group identifier and there's a place to put it. That's all fine. So a lot of these things that are listed here, they have a place in the service request. And if we're not disallowing it and we don't have anything potentially to overlay in terms of constraining it at this point in time.
Can we not just agree that we go service name? Yes, that's
Yeah,
the thing. It lives here. Can't we just do that?
I thought there'd be really simple things like authored on. Like, I think we can all agree that a service request needs an authored on date. Like, a service request needs a patient, I'd assume. Like, can we agree that a service request needs a patient?
Are you saying that's must support, or are you saying it's a mandatory field?
I'd like to think that we can lock in whether it is one or the other. Like, clear. I'm trying to think of something optional that's obvious, but like authored on, like, yeah, must support. Like, I would have thought. Like, I think we could all fairly agree that I'd be surprised if people disagree that authored on is must support, must be populated. You must do it. I'd like to think there's even some conditionals that we absolutely all agree we need it, but it doesn't mean you need to provide it the whole time. And maybe they're a bit harder, but I would have thought if we went and ran down tasks and service requests, there would be a handful of things that we think have very low contention, and we could just almost vote and make a decision here and now. Like authored on's a good example, I think. Like, are we going to argue that we're not going to have an authored on? I feel it's Danielle's point. Like, sure, there's going to be ones, there'll be some that we might think are low contention, and it turns out they are contentious. But move on. Like, let's just lock in what we all agree with as a first pass, because hopefully that gives us a basic structure, and then it's about coming back and triaging what is the least next contentious thing that we can at least debate and get to a decision on. And there'll be structural things, Andy. There'll be things that are hard to know, like how do we know the answer to this if we don't know the answer to that? But we're never going to be able to get to those points unless we try. So, you know, if we go, oh, this is contentious because we haven't made a decision on that other element, that if then we know that other element is something we have to solve. But phase one, I would have thought we try and lock in what we think we can.
We are out of time. Our next meeting is the 11th of April. I'll go to the next meeting content. We also have, which isn't in here, the 17th of April session that's out of session for sex and eRequesting. I think we need to, I've taken an action on me to provide a way for people to indicate the features that they're interested in. But I think we also have to put in the agenda for the 11th of April meeting on how we're going to go forwards with our work and what our meeting cadence is, because I'm very concerned about having just a fortnight to go through these, like an hour and a fortnight. All right. If anyone comes up with any proposals, you can contact me or the other co-chairs. I'm meanwhile, which I agreed out of the last meeting to do, will also start a mapping page of going, where does this clinical element actually, an AU eReqDI element actually live, maybe in a FHIR structure that we can start to kind of build from. and that can feed into a discussion when and if we have it on those basics. And I'll email that around when it exists. Any other comments or questions that we want to take before we close the meeting? All right. Thanks everyone for today. Oh, David, your hand's up. Sorry. Too quick.
I asked a question in the chat earlier. Do people think it might be useful for us to bring policy people, particularly around Medicare and pathology and DI policy people, to the next Connectathon? And is it worth, as we start developing our view on the technical aspect, start to bring in some UI, UX design people who might be able to flesh out what that experience might be like, or, you know, for, say, the customer, receiving a token or something like that? Do we want to get to that level?
I think it's out of scope.
I think it's too early. I think we need to get a fairly consensus of like, oh, this is the sort of working thing we have, and now bang it with policy and go, what's wrong with it? You know, bang it with UX people. How would you present it? At the moment, I feel like we're struggling to get the skeletal beginning. We haven't decision. We really have very few decisions on anything yet, so it's hard to then bring policy people in. I think we need.
I think the policy is absolutely, we do need them, because there is significant policy decisions and implications that we need to understand. So, for instance, the whole concept of directed requests and unassigned requests. What is the policy framework that underpins some of those obligations? Because we need to support the mechanisms for those policy constraints. And if we don't understand that policy constraint, some of them are, I've seen multiple interpretations of them in terms of implementation, so that would help. On the UI side, I'm very wary of being seen to be constraining what the clinical systems are how they're going to present some of this stuff. So I think that may come, but I don't think up front, that's the top priority.
Just to clarify, when I say UI, UX, I mean not necessarily from government proposing one solution, but from vendors who might bring those types of skills to the Connectathon to start to demonstrate how it might be proposed. But I can see, let's start with trying to get some policy input, and then just let us know when we think that UX, UI discussion is worthwhile having. Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions before we close the meeting? All right, I will see you in a fortnight. You'll be hearing from us via email anyway. Bye.
Bye.